Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into the driest, hottest, most relentlessly illuminated corners of the past. Places where the sun is less a comforting, celestial body and more a malevolent, inescapable overseer. Where the only thing thicker than the air is the sheer, overwhelming weight of the stone, and where the rhythmic, metallic sound of a modern construction is replaced by the dull, constant thud of exhausted human effort, an auditory testament to the ceaseless, agonizing power of the human muscle. That's right. We're talking about the deep, monumental shadow of the Fourth Dynasty, that impossibly grand stretch of centuries where the entire destiny of a civilization, its vast resources, its immense organizational genius, and the very bodies of its people were focused on one solitary, geometrically perfect objective: building a tomb so colossal it would scrape the heavens and serve as the eternal launch pad for a literal god-king. We're going to gently peel back the heavy, slightly abrasive linen of that world, not with the intention of terrifying you. Oh no, not at all, but simply to help you appreciate the utter divine simplicity of your current, comfortable immobility, nestled in a cocoon of quiet, temperature-controlled peace, and the quiet, almost scandalous miracle of being able to acquire a simple glass of cold, unsalted, clean drinking water without it being a major, life-threatening logistical triumph, requiring the efforts of an entire, organized bureaucracy to deliver it to you. Settle in and let the sheer, overwhelming, glorious logistical effort of building the impossible become the slow, hypnotic hum that finally carries you away from the comfort you are utterly failing to appreciate. The first sensation of your day as an Egyptian pyramid builder, dear listener, would not be the soft, scratchy betrayal of a straw mattress, as we have discussed in other historical explorations, but rather the hard, immediate, and utterly unforgiving reality of a sun-baked clay brick floor, which would meet the rough wool of your thin, often shared blanket. A blanket you are exceedingly lucky to have, as it represents a significant, expensive item, with an unpleasant, low-level chill that provides absolutely no comfort, but merely a temporary temperature gradient before the inevitable heat takes over. You would be snapped awake, not to the melodic chime of a timepiece, which was a technological absurdity, but to a vast, chaotic, and relentlessly unified sound, the sudden, collective groan of tens of thousands of men reluctantly rising from an exhausted, often restless sleep that was perpetually too short to fully repair the damage of the previous day's toil. This immediate auditory assault, a symphony of shifting bodies, low curses, and the deep bronchial coughs of men whose lungs were already fighting the pervasive dust, would be accompanied by a profound, overwhelming olfactory reality. The communal stench of a massive, overcrowded barrack complex, a permanent perfume of unwashed, intensely working bodies, stale sweat, thick, yeasty beer, the scent of yesterday's calories and the constant low-level alcohol haze, and the pervasive low-level ammonia of the communal latrine pits, a smell that clings to the dry air with a tenacious, acidic grip that would simply paralyze the sensitive, sanitized modern nose, a truly ancient and unmediated blend of humanity and its organic byproducts. Imagine, if you will, being one of the tens of thousands of souls housed in those vast, standardized, state-run complexes near the Giza Plateau, the very foundations of which we can still see today, a kind of ancient, highly efficient, and entirely unglamorous worker city, built with a pragmatic focus on maximum throughput and minimum expenditure of effort on anything other than the main goal. The barracks themselves were simple, long, functional halls, separated by thin, low walls, designed for maximum occupancy and minimum privacy, ensuring that every cough, every sigh, every whispered conversation, and every bodily function was a communal event. An enforced, unchosen intimacy born not of affection, but of sheer, logistical necessity. A complete and total absence of the quiet, personal space that the modern mind considers an essential human right. You would be one of perhaps a dozen men packed into a small, rough-hewn cubicle, and the sheer, unyielding heat of the Egyptian dawn, even before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, would already be starting its slow, demanding ascent. The dry, oven-like quality to the air promising a day of profound, sustained hydrological loss, a battle against dehydration that starts the moment your feet hit the hard clay. Now, let's quickly address the gentle deception that we all absorbed from childhood films. Were these men slaves? Oh, no, not in the simple Hollywood chasing after chariots of fire sense. They were, in the grand, terrifyingly organized system of the Old Kingdom, state laborers, free men, drawn from villages all across Egypt, called upon to provide a period of obligatory service, often during the annual inundation season when the Nile made farming impossible. A massive annual transfer of labor power from agriculture to construction. This was a sophisticated state-run conscription, a national service required to build the eternal resting place of a literal god-king, the pharaoh, an undertaking that required a profound, absolute commitment of the entire nation's human resource. And while they were paid in rations, and technically not chattels, the distinction is a fine, philosophical line when your days are consumed by back-breaking, dangerous labor under the absolute, non-negotiable command of an overseer. A life governed by a colossal, unyielding bureaucratic machine that simply viewed your immense, sweaty effort as a national resource, an expenditure to be managed and maximized. The immediate feeling upon rising would be one of profound, low-grade discomfort. The rough, scratchy linen skirt, kilt or shendit, rubbing against the skin, offering only a minimal barrier to the pervasive dust and sun, and the persistent, low-level itch that comes from sleeping on a hard surface in close proximity to thousands of others, a constant, abrasive awareness of your own raw, physical existence. The thought of a quiet, reflective morning, perhaps a moment to sip a smooth, hot drink and plan your day, is a luxurious absurdity that would have simply been incomprehensible. Your day is not planned. It is dictated by the relentless, all-consuming need of the colossal pile of stone waiting for you on the plateau. A silent, monumental taskmaster that does not care about your sore back, your persistent, low-grade thirst, or the profound exhaustion that already permeates your muscles. Your only choice is to rise, endure the rough texture of the linen, breathe the thick, smoky air, and surrender yourself to the immense, unnegotiable gravity of the pharaoh's cosmic ambition. A dawn that is a commitment not just to labor, but to a continuous minute-by-minute battle against the elements and the limits of your own human frailty. The necessity of fuel, dear listener, precedes all philosophy and all spiritual contemplation in the ancient world. And so we must now turn our attention to the ancient Egyptian breakfast, a monumental caloric experience that was less about culinary pleasure and more about the brutal, non-negotiable provision of raw, dense energy for a day of Herculean effort. Have you ever considered what it takes to physically move stones weighing several tons without the aid of a single engine or a metal wheel? It requires an enormous, sustained infusion of carbohydrate and liquid, a constant, massive energy transfer, and this necessity governed the massive state-run kitchens that fed the thousands of workers with almost terrifying clockwork efficiency. Your plate, which was probably just a rough piece of pottery, perhaps a flat, dried slab of mud, or simply your hand, would be piled high with the singular, unyielding staple of the Egyptian diet, bread. But this was not the soft, air-filled, yeast-risen loaf of our modern imagining. It was a heavy, dense, coarsely ground product, often made from the tough, unrefined emmer wheat, and crucially it was absolutely riddled with grit, a persistent physical contamination that was unavoidable. The process of grinding the grain, done with heavy stone hand mills, often by women whose skeletal remains show the brutal, lifelong strain of the monotonous grinding motion, ensured that the flour was always contaminated with tiny, abrasive particles of quartz and granite, a constant low-level irritant that slowly, relentlessly wore down the teeth of the entire population, a visible, physical signature of their diet that shows up clearly and painfully in the skeletal records, a process that continues with every single meal. Imagine, if you will, the constant, low-grade, grating sensation of chewing this dense, gritty loaf, a necessary, jaw-aching workout that starts your day, ensuring that by the time a builder reached his 40s, his teeth were often worn down to the pulp, the enamel entirely gone, a source of constant, excruciating, untreatable pain and chronic infection that could only be endured with a stoic, quiet resignation. And the beverage? Forget the crystal-clear, clean water you sip so casually. The primary drink of the pyramid builder was beer, a thick, murky, low-alcohol brew that was more a liquid food, a kind of yeasty, thin porridge than a simple drink. This beer was a vital, non-negotiable part of the daily ration, sometimes given out in vast quantities, because the process of brewing, boiling the water and fermentation made it significantly safer to drink than the raw water from the Nile or a local well, which was a massive vector for debilitating disease, a pragmatic public health solution born of sheer necessity, a kind of ancient state-mandated pasteurization. It was a dense, nourishing concoction, often only partially strained to remove the grain husks, and still thick and yeasty, providing a quick, much-needed burst of liquid carbohydrate to the system, a profound caloric necessity. This meant that the day, which hadn't even truly begun, was already being gently warmed by a mild, persistent buzz, a soft, low-frequency alcoholic haze that was simply a necessary function of the liquid calories and the lack of sanitation, ensuring a slightly dulled, almost stoic perspective on the relentless grind ahead, a subtle psychological dampener for the massive, sustained physical trauma to come. To supplement this immense caloric base, the workers were given onions, a vital source of vitamin C and a welcome flavor, a few dates for quick sugar, and most interestingly, large, consistent rations of meat and fish, a diet that was, frankly, astonishingly good by the standards of the ancient world. The skeletal evidence clearly shows that the builders were better fed than the average peasant, a massive state-level investment in their efficiency, a pragmatic recognition that you cannot move mountains on an empty stomach, and that the human engine requires high-quality fuel. The vast quantities of cattle bones found in the workers' town attest to the colossal, relentless slaughter required to keep the thousands of men fueled, a monumental logistical exercise in ancient food distribution that would make a modern military quartermaster weep with admiration for its complexity and scale. But even this good dense diet was part of the nightmare, a calorie-rich fuel designed not for pleasure, variety, or even simple human enjoyment, but for sheer, unmediated physical output. It was a monotonous diet of relentless, heavy starch and gritty abrasion, consumed quickly, silently, and entirely for the purpose of maintaining the human engine for its next shift. The act of eating was not a moment of social connection or culinary joy. It was a brutal, necessary refueling, a constant grinding reminder that the sheer scale of the pharaoh's ambition required the complete, non-stop, calorically supported exploitation of your every waking hour, a truth that could not be escaped even at the breakfast table, a physical transaction of fuel for pain that was the bedrock of the entire monumental undertaking. Having wrestled the dense, gritty bread into your protesting stomach and allowed the yeasty beer to settle, the most persistent, inescapable reality of the Giza experience begins its true assault. The utterly relentless, unnegotiable heat and the omnipresent, choking dust. Have you ever considered what it would be like to perform heavy, sustained physical labor, not for an hour or two, but for 10 to 12 hours a day in the direct, unshaded, unfiltered glare of the Egyptian sun, a colossal, radiating heat that simply drains the moisture from your body with a terrifying, industrial efficiency, turning your skin into a sun-baked desert surface? The march from the barracks to the massive, sprawling quarry or the base of the construction site was, in itself, a grueling preparatory ordeal, a warm-up that was already pushing your core temperature toward dangerous levels. It was a walk over ground that was not tarmac, but hard, sun-baked clay and wind-swept sand, a surface that absorbed and reflected the heat back onto your exposed skin with a brutal intensity, quickly raising your core temperature to an uncomfortable, dangerous level, and providing the first of many subtle burns to your feet and uncovered limbs. The air was not merely hot, it was a thick, breathing entity, perpetually saturated with the fine, powder-like particulate matter of the limestone that dominated the entire landscape, a residue of the colossal act of construction that coated everything with a universal, light-colored film, lending the entire scene a ghostly, pale hue. This dust, dear listener, was the silent, subtle killer of the pyramid builders, a constant, pervasive enemy that could not be avoided, a massive, unmitigated environmental hazard. It clung to the sweat on your skin, creating a rough, irritating paste that chafed your neck and limbs with every movement of your rough linen kilt, a feeling of being perpetually caked in a fine, abrasive layer of grit, a permanent, low-level skin irritation that never fully healed. But the true danger lay in the inhalation. As thousands of men worked, hammering, cutting, dragging, and leveling the massive stones, a fine, almost invisible mist of powdered limestone and sand, a constant barrage of microscopic silica, was constantly being kicked up, settling deep into the lungs with every heavy, desperate breath. imagine the constant dry, rattling cough of the men, a persistent soundtrack to the construction, a physical sign of the slow, inevitable damage being done to their respiratory systems, the calcification of the lungs, a persistent, low-grade inflammation that was simply accepted as the air one breathed on the job site, a terrible cost of breathing for eternity. There was no concept of a face mask, no break from the environmental hazard, just the raw, unrelenting exposure to the very material of the monument you were building, the mountain you were slowly, agonizingly internalizing into your own biological structure, a profound physical transaction between man and stone. Furthermore, the immense scale of the effort meant that every day was a constant, losing battle against dehydration. Sweat poured from the body in torrents, evaporating almost instantly in the dry heat, leading to a state of perpetual, profound thirst that could only be partially quenched by the murky, yeasty beer, which was often warm and salty, and the constant, gnawing craving for the cool, life-saving taste of simple, clean water. A luxury that was far too valuable and scarce for casual consumption. The sheer, logistical nightmare of providing enough potable liquid to keep thousands of men functioning under these conditions was a massive state enterprise in itself, a constant battle against the Egyptian climate that defined the entire rhythm of the workday, a struggle that was both physical and bureaucratic. The heat, the sun, the deep, pervasive dust, and the constant debilitating thirst were the undramatized, non-negotiable realities of the job. A quiet, physical torture that began the moment you stepped out of the barracks and only ended when you collapsed back onto your clay floor at the end of the shift. A relentless environmental assault that served as a constant, unforgiving reminder that your body was simply a tool, a finite resource being expended in the service of an eternal, stone-cold ambition that simply did not allow for a moment of clean, cool, unchoked air. Having endured the harsh march and the blinding sun, we now arrive at the quarry itself, the great yawning gash in the Giza Plateau, where the monumental process of creation began. And this, dear listener, is where the simple lack of sophisticated technology translates directly into a colossal increase in pure, unadulterated human effort, a deep, primal battle against the hardness of the earth itself. Have you ever considered the profound difficulty of cutting a massive block of stone without the benefit of a single piece of steel or a modern explosive? This is the core trauma of the pyramid builder's work. A persistent physical battle against geological time using tools that were entirely inadequate for the task, requiring a staggering output of sustained, monotonous force to compensate for the technological deficit. The primary materials for the core of the pyramids were local, soft limestone, which was relatively easier to work than granite, but still required a monumental effort to free from the bedrock. The workers were armed not with the sharp, durable edge of iron or steel, which was not yet in common use, but with tools made of copper, a soft, easily dulled metal that was utterly useless for sustained cutting of any hard stone, and certainly no match for the dense limestone. So how did they remove the hundreds of thousands of massive blocks? Through the relentless, bone-jarring application of brute force and abrasion, a technique that was as simple as it was physically exhausting, a colossal, rhythmic, concussive effort that was the true engine of the construction. The primary tool was the dolerite pounder, a round, heavy ball of hard volcanic rock, often weighing 5 to 10 pounds, wielded not with a delicate, precise movement, but with a colossal, repeated swinging and smashing action, a rhythmic, concussive assault on the limestone bedrock, a technique that transformed the human body into a primitive, heavy-duty jackhammer. Imagine the hundreds of men, their torsos bare in the relentless sun, standing shoulder to shoulder in the quarry, raising and slamming these heavy, unforgiving rocks down onto the surface of the softer limestone. Hour after hour, day after day, a continuous, deafening, and profoundly exhausting symphony of dull, heavy thuds that was the dominant acoustic feature of the Giza Plateau, a constant physical reminder of the sheer, raw effort being expended. This process was not clean. It was a brutal, dust-choked affair, slowly pulverizing the stone, creating trenches and channels around the intended block, isolating it not with a clean, sharp cut, but with an immense manual act of chipping and battering that shook the very ground beneath their feet and sent constant, repetitive shocks through the shoulders, elbows, and wrists of the workers, leading to inevitable, chronic joint damage and tendinitis that would never be fully treated. Once the channels were roughly cut, they would then use simple copper chisels, which were constantly being blunted and required immediate, monotonous resharpening, or even massive wooden wedges driven into naturally occurring cracks, which would be soaked with water to swell and slowly split the massive block from the bedrock. A slow, tense process that required a massive commitment of patience and constant, low-level vigilance. A constant negotiation with the stubborn, slow-moving physics of rock. The weight of the tools, the difficulty of the material, and the utter lack of any mechanical advantage meant that every single block, whether it weighed a few hundred pounds or several tons, represented a massive, non-negotiable expenditure of individual human strength, a sheer, unmediated transaction between the rock and the human muscle. The relentless, concussive force of the dolerite pounders traveling up the arms would lead to a pervasive, chronic joint pain. A constant physical reminder of the job that would stay with the builders long after the shift had ended, permanently altering the shape and function of their skeletal structure. A true physical signature of the colossal, repetitive effort that defined their lives. A slow, grinding transformation of the human body into a mere extension of the stone hammer, a raw tool in service of a divine will. Having wrestled with the relatively pliable local limestone, we must now turn our exhausted minds to the true material nightmare of the pyramid project. The exotic, non-local stone, particularly the Aswan granite, which was the material of choice for the burial chambers, the vital internal organs of the massive monument, and the complex internal passageways. This was not a local job. This was a logistical, inter-regional horror show, a transportation crisis of colossal, pre-modern scale that required the synchronization of massive river fleets and thousands of specialist haulers. Have you ever considered what it would be like to move a single block of stone, often weighing 50 or even 80 tons, a weight that a modern crane would treat with caution, over a distance of nearly 500 miles without a single wheel or engine to assist you, relying entirely on the unpredictable power of a river? This is the brutal, logistical quantum leap that was required for the granite. Aswan, located far to the south, near the first cataract of the Nile, was the source of this incredibly hard, beautiful red stone, a material that was prized for its durability, its subtle crystalline sheen, and its stunning, unlocal color, a powerful symbol of the pharaoh's reach and his ability to command the resources of the entire kingdom. The sheer physical reality of quarrying this granite was an order of magnitude more difficult than the soft limestone. Granite is an incredibly hard, crystalline rock, entirely resistant to the simple copper chisels used on the limestone. To cut it, the builders had to rely entirely on abrasion, a brutal, grinding process that used even harder dolerite pounders and the application of wet sand and quartzes as an abrasive slurry, slowly, painstakingly wearing away the material, a process so slow and monotonous that it would test the limits of human patience, requiring literally months of constant, relentless manual grinding and battering to free a single block from the bedrock, a geological battle measured in millimeters per month. Once freed, these massive, unforgiving blocks, many of them larger than an entire modern car, had to be loaded onto colossal, specially constructed wooden barges, the largest watercraft of the ancient world, designed to navigate the fickle, shifting currents of the Nile, while carrying a staggering, unbalanced load, a constant, tense battle against the massive weight that threatened to capsize the vessel at any moment. The simple physics of displacement being pushed to their absolute maximum. Imagine the quiet, terrifying fear of the men on those barges, their entire livelihood and their lives dependent on the structural integrity of a massive wooden hull, slowly carrying a cargo of colossal, unforgiving granite that could easily drag them to the bottom of the deep, mysterious river with a single splintering crack. The journey up the Nile against the current required the immense, synchronized pulling power of thousands of oarsmen or the constant, patient manipulation of sails to catch the prevailing northerly wind. A slow, agonizing passage that measured the progress of eternity in feet per day. A profound temporal commitment that made the delivery of a single piece of stone an event of massive, state-level significance, a celebration of logistical endurance. And when the blocks finally arrived at Giza, they had to be unloaded, dragged over the soft, shifting sands of the western bank. A brief, muscle-tearing ordeal, and then finally hauled up the vast, ever-growing ramps of the pyramid itself. A colossal feat of human pulling power that required not hundreds, but sometimes thousands of men working in unison, pulling heavy sledges over lubricated tracks, their entire collective strength reduced to a single vector of force, all for the benefit of a single, unyielding, 50-ton block of red, uncompromising Aswan granite. A distant symbol of the pharaoh's power that was paid for with the immediate, visceral pain of the human muscle. This specialized trauma, this immense logistical commitment to moving the hardest stone over the longest distance, was a constant, profound reminder that the entire nation, its resources, its technology, and its immense manpower were entirely dedicated to the single, impossible goal of overcoming the limits of geography and material science, a truly nightmarish application of total, unwavering, state-mandated human effort, a supreme, non-negotiable act of geological will. Once the massive blocks, whether local limestone or distant granite, were freed from the earth and delivered to the base of the construction site. The next and perhaps most iconic phase of the nightmare began. the transportation and ascent, the logistical ballet of pain that was required to lift a mountain of stone to an impossible height. Have you ever tried to move something immensely heavy without wheels or rollers, relying entirely on friction and raw muscle? It is a frustrating, muscle-tearing experience, but the ancient Egyptians faced this challenge with a staggering simplicity, relying entirely on the collective harnessed power of the human body and the pragmatic efficiency of the sledge. The massive blocks were not placed on wheeled carts, which were simply unsuitable for the rough, uneven ground of the plateau and the steep ramps. They were lashed securely onto heavy wooden sledges, and then the human engine was engaged. This required teams of men, often dozens or even hundreds for the largest blocks, pulling the heavy ropes attached to the sledge, their feet planted on ground that was often deliberately lubricated with wet sand or water. A practical, ingenious hack that reduced the friction to a manageable level, a surface that required a whole secondary team of workers to maintain and constantly lubricate, a testament to the level of logistical support required for every basic movement. Imagine the quiet, intense suffering of these pulling teams, their bodies hunched low, their hands raw and blistered from the thick hemp ropes, their muscles screaming in unison as they leaned their full weight into the load, their breath coming in ragged, unified gasps, all under the relentless, unforgiving glare of the sun. The process was entirely rhythmic, governed by the constant chanting of the overseers, a necessary cadence that maintained the pace and synchronization of the pulling teams, a hypnotic, deep-throated sound that was the true, constant background music of the Giza construction site, a rhythm of pain and propulsion that kept the stone inching forward. Every foot of progress was a battle against gravity, friction, and the sheer, unyielding weight of the material, a moment-by-moment negotiation with the physical limits of the human tendon and bone, a profound, immediate awareness of the immense difficulty of simply moving an inert object across the surface of the earth. But the ultimate challenge was the ascent. As the pyramid grew taller, the stone had to be hauled up the massive, sloping earth and rubble ramps that surrounded the monument. Ramps that were constantly being added to, extended, and maintained, a colossal, parallel construction project in themselves. The angle of these ramps was steep, the footing treacherous, often covered in the same slick, lubricated surface that helped the sledge move, and the air was thick with the dust kicked up by the thousands of toiling feet, meaning that the final ascent of the blocks was a slow, agonizing, vertical haul, a final, immense expenditure of energy that could easily lead to a slip, a loss of footing, a rope snapping, or a catastrophic loss of control over the massive load, which would instantly and indiscriminately crush any man caught in its path, a danger that was an omnipresent, silent member of the team. The sight of a team of men successfully hauling a multi-ton block up the steep, dusty incline, their bodies bowed and glistening with sweat, their faces contorted in a silent, collective grimace of effort, was the ultimate physical demonstration of the pharaoh's power, a visual affirmation that the sheer, massed force of the Egyptian state could literally defy gravity and raise a mountain to the sky, a monumental triumph of collective suffering that made the concept of a bad day's work a profound, insulting understatement. The sheer repetition, the constant, muscle-destroying strain, the raw, skin-chafing friction of the ropes, and the perpetual dehydration were the true, invisible builders of the pyramid, their silent, aching sacrifice woven into the very structure of the colossal tomb, a profound physical legacy that endures to this day, a monument to the unyielding power of coordinated human suffering. As the blocks inexorably crawled up the vast, sloping ramps, and the structure of the pyramid itself began to assume its final, colossal shape, the nature of the nightmare subtly shifted to include the terrifying, dizzying vulnerability of working at immense heights. Have you ever considered the profound, existential terror of laboring hundreds of feet above the ground, balanced precariously on rough, uneven stone, with no harnesses, no safety netting, and no railing to protect you from the long, unforgiving drop to the hard, dusty plateau far below? This was the daily reality of the final placement teams, the men responsible for maneuvering the colossal stones into their exact, designated position on the face of the growing monument, a job that required an astonishing combination of immense strength, profound precision, and utter, non-negotiable fearlessness, a constant battle against the simple, terrifying physics of gravity. The higher the pyramid grew, the more profound the danger became, transforming the work site into a colossal, slow-motion ballet of high-altitude risk, a place where a moment of inattention meant instant, permanent oblivion. The final positioning of the blocks was a meticulous, millimeter-precise process, requiring the use of levers, shims, and the intense, localized application of manual force to gently coax the rough-hewn stone into its tight, perfect fit with the blocks around it, a testament to the high skill of these placement teams. Imagine the pressure of this moment. A massive, heavy stone hanging precariously, ready to swing or shift, with several men crouched down using simple wooden levers to apply force, their entire focus narrowed down to a single point of leverage, knowing that a single slip of a wedge, a crack in the lever, or a mistimed push could result in the massive block either dropping out of control or crushing the limbs of the men working below it, a truly lethal game of precision engineering. The margin for error was non-existent. The integrity of the pharaoh's eternal home depended on the absolute structural perfection of the fit, and the cost of a mistake was not a simple reprimand, but likely a catastrophic, lethal failure of the entire process, or a swift, brutal punishment for the man responsible. The air at these heights was thinner, the sun's glare was even more intense, and the wind, which provided no real comfort, was a constant, subtle threat. A brief, unexpected gust that could destabilize an already precariously balanced load, or cause a man to momentarily lose his footing on the dusty, uneven surface. The constant, gnawing awareness of the height, the dizzying view of the tiny distant barracks below, and the profound, silent realization that your only safety measure was the steadiness of your own hands and the absolute, perfect cooperation of your immediate team created a psychological pressure that added an unbearable weight to the already crushing physical demands of the job, a kind of constant, low-level adrenaline spike that exhausted the mind as much as the body. The sheer physical exertion of pushing, pulling, and leveraging massive weights while maintaining a precarious balance on an uneven surface was a test of strength and endurance. But the true burden was the unceasing adrenaline-spiking fear of the fall, the persistent low-grade terror of the final, long plunge that would instantly end the relentless cycle of labor and pain. The skeletal remains of the pyramid builders often show healed fractures consistent with falls from height, grim evidence of the relentless, casual proximity of death and injury, a constant physical signature of the immense height and the terrifying lack of safety measures. The men working on the face of the pyramid were, in essence, structural mountaineers, their lives entirely dependent on the collective, precise application of ancient physics and the non-negotiable demand for perfection, a daily life-or-death performance enacted for the benefit of a god who was already halfway to the stars. As the colossal, multi-ton blocks were wrestled into their final, terrifyingly high positions, the very air around the construction site was not only hot and dry, but absolutely saturated with the fine, abrasive powder of the primary building material, leading to a profound, pervasive, and chronic problem: the unceasing tyranny of the dust. Have you ever considered a world where the air you breathe is literally trying to turn your lungs into stone, where every inhalation is a subtle, corrosive act of self-damage? This is the reality of life on the Giza Plateau, a constant, low-level assault on the respiratory system that defined the long-term health, or rather, the inevitable decline, of the pyramid builder. The massive scale of the cutting, shaping, dragging, and final placement of the limestone, hundreds of thousands of blocks being constantly scraped, pounded, and moved, created a permanent, ambient cloud of fine, calciferous powder, a pale, chalky mist that hung over the entire worksite, impossible to avoid, a form of industrial air pollution that dwarfed any modern equivalent. This was not the light, passing dust of a dry field. It was a dense, microscopic irritant that coated every surface, permeated every article of clothing, and, most damagingly, was drawn deep into the lungs with every single, heavy, desperate breath of the working man. Imagine the constant, rasping irritation in the throat, the persistent, dry cough that simply would not go away, a constant, rattling sound that was the true, subtle soundtrack of the construction, a grim chorus of men slowly, unknowingly, filling their pulmonary systems with the very material of the monument, an internal, low-grade, calcifying disease that was the ultimate occupational hazard. Furthermore, the dust was a profound, daily irritant to the eyes, which, in the harsh, dry, sun-blasted glare of the desert, were constantly battling against conjunctivitis and the sheer physical abrasion of the microscopic grit. A perpetual, uncomfortable film over the surface of the eye that made clear, easy vision a luxury, contributing to the persistent eye ailments that were endemic in ancient Egypt, a constant, painful struggle just to see clearly. There was no concept of industrial hygiene, no attempt to mitigate the problem with water sprays or ventilation. The men simply endured the constant, low-grade assault, the price of which was a life lived with a chronic, debilitating respiratory distress and a perpetually itchy, irritated body. The sweat, which poured from the body in torrents, mixed instantly with the dust to form a rough, abrasive paste that clung to the skin, chafing the limbs and adding another layer of physical discomfort to the already immense muscular pain. This abrasive coating was particularly problematic for the men responsible for the final, precise placement of the blocks, who had to handle the rough, dusty stone for hours on end, leading to skin irritations, small cuts, and the inevitable high risk of infection, as the microscopic grit was introduced into the open wound. The omnipresent dust was the great equalizer, a non-negotiable environmental hazard that affected every single worker, regardless of their skill or rank. A democratic form of daily suffering that was simply a fundamental part of the job. A quiet, physical signature of the colossal, air-polluting industry of building for eternity. This constant, invisible enemy was a powerful reminder that the very act of constructing the pharaoh's tomb was not just an external, physical process, but a profound internal one. A slow, biological sacrifice that literally incorporated the building materials into the living, breathing structure of the working man, ensuring that a piece of the pyramid, in the form of fine, calciferous dust, would remain within their lungs long after the final block was placed, a permanent, physical monument to their relentless, exhausting, and entirely unsanitized toil. A testament to the fact that their very breath was literally being stolen by the stone. The inevitable consequence of such immense physical labor, conducted under brutal environmental conditions and terrifying heights, was a constant, relentless barrage of injury, making the medical tent, or what passed for it, a profoundly necessary but utterly harrowing component of the Giza construction complex. Have you ever considered what it would be like to suffer a severe, debilitating injury? A compound fracture, a massive crush wound, a deep, infected cut, in a world entirely devoid of antibiotics, sterile tools, or even a basic understanding of germ theory. This is the core terror of the ancient Egyptian work site, a daily roll of the biological dice where a simple mistake could swiftly transition from a temporary setback to a life-ending or limb-destroying catastrophe. Profound, immediate awareness of their own physical fragility. The skeletal remains of the workers found in the cemeteries near the pyramids are a silent, profound testament to this constant, casual proximity of physical trauma, showing clear evidence of severe, healed injuries, crushed vertebrae from carrying immense loads, compound fractures in the arms and legs, the loss of digits, and the pervasive, low-level chronic damage of severe arthritis and joint strain, the physical signature of a life lived pushing the human body far past its sustainable limit, a brutal record etched into the bone itself. The medical care available was a strange, often brutal mix of pragmatic skill and utter desperate superstition. The surgeons and doctors who worked at the site, often highly trained for the ancient world, were remarkably adept at setting complex fractures and performing basic amputations, skills honed by constant, grim necessity and a profound knowledge of bone and muscle structure gained through constant, unavoidable practice. They would use rough splints and bandages, employing a knowledge of anatomy gleaned through centuries of embalming. But their efforts were fundamentally undermined by their complete ignorance of the microscopic world. Imagine a deep, open wound, packed with honey, or a paste of moldy bread. A surprisingly effective ancient antibiotic, thanks to penicillin molds, but entirely non-sterile, or the setting of a complex fracture with unsterilized hands and rough wooden splints. An immediate, unnegotiable invitation to a catastrophic secondary infection, a hidden, slow-motion killer that would swiftly turn a survivable injury into a long, feverish, and agonizing death. Furthermore, the constant exposure to the endemic parasites and diseases of the Nile Valley, bilharzia, dysentery, and other waterborne nightmares, meant that the workers were in a perpetual state of low-grade illness, their immune systems constantly struggling against a host of unseen enemies, making the recovery from a physical injury a massive, uphill battle against an already overtaxed biological defense system. The loss of a finger, a limb, or the use of a back was not merely a personal tragedy. It was an economic death sentence in a world without state welfare or disability benefits, a sudden, brutal transition from a valuable state asset to an unproductive mouth to feed, a social and economic catastrophe that added another layer of quiet, desperate anxiety to the immense physical risk of the job. The sheer physical demand of the work ensured that the body was always in a state of high vulnerability. One slip of the foot, one misjudged pull, one falling tool, was all it took to permanently change the course of a life. A constant, terrifying awareness that every step, every lift, and every moment on the high, windy scaffold was a high-stakes gamble against the casual, unforgiving brutality of ancient industrial trauma. The medical tent, with its rough-hewn beds, its stench of blood and sweat, and its sound of pained guttural moans, was a constant, visible reminder that the price of building eternity was a profound, immediate, and utterly painful sacrifice of the fragile, temporary human body, a place where the line between living and dying was drawn with a rough, unsterile copper blade. The monumental nature of the Pyramid Project required an organizational feat of staggering, bureaucratic complexity, a logistical machine that extended far beyond the Giza Plateau itself, and nowhere was this more evident than in the immense, relentless provisioning of the workers' food rations. The sheer number of men, tens of thousands, laboring non-stop for months or even years, demanded a constant, massive, and highly organized flow of grain, fish, and, most remarkably, meat, turning the state itself into the largest, most relentlessly active caterer in the ancient world. Have you ever considered the bookkeeping nightmare of feeding a standing army of this size, 3 meals a day, for an indeterminate period of time, all without modern digital inventory, automated refrigeration, or mechanized transport? This was the undramatized, unromanticized genius of the Egyptian state, a triumph of ancient logistics that was the true, unseen backbone of the entire project. The rations were not haphazard. They were standardized, meticulously documented, and often measured down to the grain, a pragmatic act of state policy that ensured the workers received a massive, dependable caloric input. Hence, the astonishingly good diet revealed by the skeletal evidence, a level of sustenance that was utterly necessary to maintain the colossal energy output required for the work, a massive state-level accounting of human fuel. Imagine the scribes perched on the edge of the construction site, their rough papyrus scrolls and ink pots recording the daily outflow of grain from the vast state silos, the precise tally of beer distributed, measured in hundreds of gallons, and the immense, almost daily slaughter of cattle required to meet the protein demands of the workforce. A logistical paper trail that extended all the way back to the royal estates and farms up and down the Nile Valley. The entire state infrastructure, working in synchronized, tireless service of the construction schedule. The constant provision of meat, a luxury that would have been a rarity for the average peasant, was the key to this system. A massive, state-level investment in the efficiency of their human resource, a pragmatic calculation that a well-fed worker, even a fatigued one, was a productive worker. A constant physical reminder that their value was entirely tied to their ability to sustain the physical grind. A life lived as a highly valued but ultimately expendable piece of the national inventory. The logistical scale was astonishing. The state had to maintain massive herds, coordinate their transport to the Giza site, and maintain the vast, necessary network of slaughterhouses and communal kitchens. A constant rhythmic cycle of supply and demand that was entirely non-negotiable, because the cessation of even one day's food supply would mean the immediate, catastrophic halt of the entire, colossal project. The barracks town was, therefore, not just a place to sleep. It was a massive, centralized food processing and distribution center. A continuous, loud and bustling hub of activity where grain was ground, bread was baked in colossal ovens, and the ubiquitous beer was brewed in staggering volumes. A low-frequency hum of caloric provision that underlay the more dramatic sounds of the quarrying and dragging. The act of receiving the rations, the simple, necessary cue for the day's bread and beer, was a profound daily ritual, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of their dependence on the massive, impersonal machine of the state, a profound understanding that their very sustenance was tied to the completion of the monumental task. This relentless, organized provisioning was the true, unsung miracle of the pyramids, the complex, hidden engine of logistics that made the impossible a tangible, stone-by-stone reality. A massive, bureaucratic headache that ensured the workers were too well fed to rebel, but too exhausted and dependent to question the profound, physical cost of the immense caloric exchange. A perfect, self-sustaining system of exploitation and efficiency. We now turn to the interior experience of the pyramid builder, the profound psychological weight of the task that was, arguably, a heavier burden than any single stone they dragged, the terrifying, existential gravity of building for a literal, unquestioned God-king, and the sheer, overwhelming scale of the project. Have you ever considered what it would be like to dedicate your entire, grueling existence to a single, perfect object that you know, with absolute certainty, you will never see finished in your lifetime, a mountain built not for the living, but for the soul of one man to ascend to the stars? The psychological atmosphere of the work site was dominated by an unshakable belief in the divinity of the pharaoh, the unquestioned conviction that this colossal effort was not merely a construction project, but a necessary, essential cosmic act, the only path to maintaining Ma'at, the divine order of the universe, a spiritual gravity that made their suffering not meaningless, but cosmically vital. This profound spiritual commitment was the essential psychological glue that held the entire enterprise together, transforming the back-breaking toil into a sacred, non-negotiable duty, a spiritual service that transcended the pain of the present, earthly moment, and gave their short, difficult lives immense, unshakable meaning. Imagine the builders, their muscles screaming, their hands raw, enduring the heat and the dust, but finding a source of silent, almost ecstatic strength in the profound realization that their immediate, sweaty suffering was directly contributing to the eternal journey of a living God, a spiritual destiny that elevated their status far above the mundane drudgery of ordinary peasant life. A life lived with a sense of purpose that the modern, secular mind can only envy and misunderstand. But intertwined with this spiritual conviction was the sheer, overwhelming scale of the challenge itself. Look up, dear listener, at the colossal, geometric mountain rising before you, an object so massive that its base covers 13 acres, and its final height seems to vanish into the relentless blue of the Egyptian sky. The simple, non-negotiable reality of that scale, the hundreds of thousands of individual blocks, the years of non-stop labor, the sheer amount of earth and stone that had to be moved, shaped, and hauled, created a profound, humbling awareness of their own smallness, a realization that they were merely one tiny, interchangeable muscle in a colossal, geological scale effort. There was no concept of the big picture for the individual. The task was simply the next stone, the next sledge, the next hour of swinging the pounder, a relentless, focused reduction of their consciousness to the immediate, demanding physical act. The completion of the work was a distant, theoretical event, a magnificent abstraction that their children might witness, a profound, humbling understanding that they were merely a temporary, expendable part of a vast, multi-generational machine, their own lifetime being a mere fraction of the project's duration. This profound psychological weight, the tension between the divine purpose and the physical agony, between the personal sacrifice and the monumental, impersonal scale, was the true, unseen yoke of the pyramid builder. It was a pressure that required a total surrender of individual will to the collective, sacred purpose, a mental and emotional collapse into the non-negotiable flow of the state-mandated work, a life where the personal dream was entirely subsumed by the pharaoh's eternal, stone-cold ambition, the single, terrifyingly perfect object that was the only truth in their entire, arduous, sun-blasted world, a purpose that gave their profound suffering a dignity that mere wages could never have provided. As the colossal construction neared its zenith, the nature of the labor focused on a terrifying fusion of immense strength and astonishing, delicate precision. The placement of the fine, white casing stones, the final, gleaming, geometrically perfect outer layer that gave the pyramid its famous, smooth, unassailable finish. This process was a nightmare of a different kind, swapping the brute force of the quarry for the exquisite, nerve-wracking pressure of maintaining perfection at immense, lethal heights. The casing stones were made from the finest, purest white Tura limestone, brought from quarries across the Nile, and these were the surfaces that had to be cut, dressed, and polished to a mirror-like finish, ensuring that the entire pyramid shimmered under the intense Egyptian sun, a literal beacon of the pharaoh's glory and a blinding demonstration of human craft. Have you ever considered the level of geometric accuracy required to make a massive block of stone fit perfectly with its 7 surrounding neighbors without any mortar or gap, and to maintain that level of perfection across a base of 13 acres and a height of over 400 feet? This required a level of ancient surveying, leveling, and cutting skill that is still a source of profound, humbling mystery today, a testament to the supreme precision of the master builders, a feat of engineering that relied on simple tools and unshakable manual accuracy. The placement teams for these final stones had to be the most skilled, the most precise, and the most utterly fearless of all the workers. They were operating on a steep, finished, often slippery surface. The final layer of stone was slick from being polished, moving multi-ton blocks with levers and ropes, nudging them into a fit so precise that a modern engineer would marvel, all while perched precariously on a dizzying slope, with the knowledge that a single, clumsy movement could send the heavy, precisely cut stone tumbling down the massive incline, crushing any man in its path and irrevocably scarring the perfect, finished face of the monument. The tools for this stage were different: finer copper chisels, rubbing blocks, and abrasive sands, all used to slowly, meticulously achieve the final, seamless polish. A process that was slow, monotonous, and demanded an absolute, non-negotiable focus on the minute detail, a stark contrast to the coarse, brutal smashing of the quarry. The physical demand was less about brute, concussive force, and more about sustained, localized, and profoundly painful friction. The rubbing of the stone, the fine polishing of the surface, hour after hour, until the Tura limestone literally glowed with a pure, white light. A delicate, repetitive torture that caused profound abrasions to the hands and wrists. The final, crowning horror, of course, was the capstone, the single, sacred block that would sit atop the final, impossible peak of the structure. A process that required a massive, terrifying effort of hauling, balancing, and final placement at a height that defied human scale. The successful placement of this final block, which was often sheathed in gold or electrum to reflect the sun, was the ultimate collective exhale of a civilization, the final, terrifying moment of structural success that transitioned the physical monument into a completed spiritual machine. The men who placed that final stone were the last to stand on the peak, and their immediate, terrifying task was then to begin the process of dismantling the vast, life-sustaining ramps from the top down, a slow, dangerous descent that exposed them to the full, dizzying terror of the height, a final undoing of the logistical infrastructure that had made the entire colossal effort possible, ensuring that the smooth, perfect, unassailable surface was all that remained, a silent, gleaming white monument to a massive, generation-long act of precise, dangerous, and entirely unharnessed human labor, the ultimate perfect crown on a terrifyingly difficult achievement. The immense, organized human effort required for the construction was not merely physical, it was a profound, logistical act of engineering, a process that required the synchronization of a diverse, enormous, and highly specialized workforce, a level of organizational complexity that utterly dwarfs the random, self-directed chaos of the modern labor market. Have you ever considered the sheer complexity of coordinating tens of thousands of men, none of whom had a wristwatch, on a single massive task, ensuring that the right block arrived at the right height at the right time? This was the true, silent genius of the master builders, the high-level nightmare that ensured the steady, non-stop flow of labor and material. The workforce was rigidly stratified, a massive human hierarchy that extended from the lowly, general laborer pulling a sledge to the highly skilled quarry foreman, the master mason, and the supreme architect. At the bottom were the simple, non-specialized pulling teams, the men whose only job was to haul the colossal blocks up the ramps, an utterly exhausting, repetitive, and entirely non-skilled task that formed the vast, sweaty base of the pyramid of labor. These men were organized into highly efficient named units, often called files, or gangs, which were further subdivided into smaller, highly competitive teams, the very names of which, like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkar, speak of a powerful, competitive group identity that was deliberately fostered by the state to maintain morale and speed of work, a sophisticated ancient management technique. Above them were the highly skilled artisans, the coppersmiths who constantly sharpened the dull tools, the masons who dressed the stones to their final, perfect shape, the surveyors who used astronomical observation and simple, pragmatic water-leveling techniques to ensure the absolute geometric perfection of the structure, and the scribes who meticulously documented every single ration, every tool, and every man, a massive paper trail that kept the entire complex system accountable. The noise of this organization was a constant, shifting cacophony. The rhythmic, high-pitched chanting of the pulling teams, the sharp, authoritative shout of the overseer, the steady clink, clink, clink of the coppersmith resharpening a chisel, and the lower, monotonous drone of the scribes dictating inventories. This massive, coordinated effort was maintained not through fear alone, but through a deeply ingrained system of discipline, reward, the excellent rations, and an absolute, shared belief in the divine purpose of the work. The immense, sprawling barracks town was itself a masterpiece of logistical organization, a perfect temporary city designed purely to house and feed the labor force with maximum efficiency, with specialized areas for food production, tools storage, and barracks living, a kind of massive, open-air, state-managed factory designed for the singular purpose of human mobilization. The pyramid builder's life was, therefore, not a random, chaotic struggle. It was a life lived entirely within the rigid, powerful, and utterly unnegotiable structure of a massive, totalizing state bureaucracy that dictated the time he woke, the food he ate, the work he performed, and the precise rhythmic sound he made while performing it. A perfect ancient machine of human and material resource management that allowed the impossible to be achieved through sheer, synchronized, organized will. The quiet rhythm of the construction, slow and laborious as it was profoundly dictated and occasionally disrupted by the very geography that made Egyptian civilization possible, the Nile River and its annual dramatic cycle of inundation, which dictated the rhythm of the work and introduced a fresh annual round of pervasive, low-level sickness. Have you ever considered the profound, paradoxical reality of a massive construction project that had to pause its core function every year, shifting its workforce and its focus entirely to accommodate the dictates of a flooding river? The most intense period of pyramid construction, the colossal, organized influx of labor, was during the season of Akhet, the 3 to 4 months when the Nile rose, flooding the fertile plains, making agricultural work impossible, and thus freeing a massive pool of state labor for the pharaoh's work, a phenomenon that literally turned the river into the timekeeper for the entire nation's building schedule. This was the brilliant pragmatic stroke of Egyptian organization, utilizing the unavoidable period of agricultural downtime for monumental construction. A massive annual transfer of manpower from the fields to the quarry and the haulage ramps, a logistical feat that turned a natural disaster into a national asset, a massive, temporary surge of human energy. The flood, of course, was essential for the fertilization of the land, providing the rich, black silt that was the engine of their agriculture, but it was also a massive, annual vector of disease. as the river expanded and then slowly receded, leaving behind rich, fertile silt. It also left behind vast, stagnant pools of water, which were the perfect slow-motion incubators for all the parasites, bacteria, and endemic diseases that plagued the ancient world. The workers, housed in their crowded barracks, drinking the murky, often contaminated water, and exposed to the constant presence of the flood-borne vectors of illness, were subject to a continuous annual wave of dysentery, fever, and the relentless, debilitating internal trauma of waterborne parasites like schistosomiasis, a sickness that would slowly, inexorably drain their strength and vitality, often leading to chronic organ damage. Imagine the constant, low-grade fever that permeated the barracks, the endless queues for the rudimentary medical care, the quiet, daily fear of the sudden, rapid decline of a colleague, a mass of low-level, invisible sickness that was a constant drain on the immense workforce, often leading to a sudden, permanent, and untraceable death, a life-ending consequence that was simply factored into the massive human cost of the project. The annual flood was, therefore, a massive, double-edged sword. It was the engine of civilization, providing the food and the manpower, but it was also the relentless, natural killer, a force that ensured that the construction cycle was punctuated by a necessary, annual reckoning with the forces of illness and death. A quiet, non-negotiable cost of life lived in intimate, unsanitized proximity to the powerful but profoundly disease-ridden river. The need to maintain an immense, healthy workforce in the face of this annual biological threat was another layer of the managerial nightmare. A constant battle against the simple, biological reality of the unsanitized environment, ensuring that the cost of eternity was paid not only in the sweat of the brow and the trauma of the bone, but also in the invisible, internal struggle against a constant barrage of tiny, relentless, and often lethal, unseen enemies that were the quiet, constant companions of every single man working to build a God's eternal home. In the moments that punctuated the relentless rhythm of the workday, whether it was the brief break for a ration of bread and beer, or the quiet, smoky hours before the exhausted collapse into sleep, the pyramid builder's experience was one of a profound and total lack of personal solitude, a life lived entirely within the constant, overwhelming presence of thousands of other human beings. The communal nature of the barracks, as we have touched upon, was the architectural embodiment of this lack of privacy, but the experience extended far beyond the sleeping arrangements. Have you ever considered a world where the noise of the crowd is your constant, non-negotiable soundtrack, where silence is only an accidental, momentary lapse in the collective human effort? The noise of the work site was one thing, the hammering, the chanting, the shouting, but the barracks town was an entirely different kind of acoustic environment, a massive, loud and bustling hub of non-stop human activity that never truly quieted down. Imagine the sheer volume of tens of thousands of men eating, talking, arguing, gambling with knucklebones, organizing their meager possessions, and simply existing in close, constant proximity, a continuous, low-frequency hum of collective humanity that would simply overwhelm the modern, solitude-seeking mind. The communal kitchens, with their massive ovens and constant activity, added the rhythmic sound of the bread bakers and the constant, dull roar of the fires, a sound that promised food and warmth, but entirely banish the possibility of quiet contemplation. The simple games and the low-stakes gambling, often played with pieces of marked pottery or carved stone, were the primary forms of evening entertainment, loud, boisterous, and entirely communal activities that reinforced the collective structure and offered a brief, necessary distraction from the relentless physical pain of the day, a psychological release valve that was shared by all. The only escape from this noise, this constant, unmediated collective presence, was the deep, dreamless oblivion of exhausted sleep, the body's ultimate, non-negotiable demand for temporary cessation. There were no quiet corners, no locked doors, no personal spaces to retreat into, no chance to simply sit in silence and process the profound trauma of the day, an absolute, total absence of personal solitude that would be a form of profound psychological torture for the modern, individualistic mind. The pyramid builder's mind, however, was likely simply conditioned to this constant presence, this continuous hum of collective existence, a form of ancient psychological conditioning that made the simple, shared experience of the collective the most familiar and most comfortable state of being. The silence of deep solitude would have been a profoundly unsettling, even frightening experience, an unnatural state that suggested a dangerous separation from the life-sustaining security of the collective. This profound lack of privacy was, therefore, not merely a physical inconvenience. It was a fundamental feature of the psychological landscape, a constant, abrasive awareness of the collective, a perpetual, intense social immersion that ensured that the only true, isolated experience the pyramid builder ever had was the final, non-negotiable journey of his own individual soul after his exhaustion finally found its ultimate permanent release. In these final, fading moments before the descent into the silence of sleep, let us consider the sensory experience of the pyramid builder's night, a world that was profoundly, utterly dark in a way that the modern person can barely conceive. Our nights are merely dimmed, illuminated by the pervasive, subtle glow of light pollution that filters up from distant cities, a perpetual, orange-tinged twilight that entirely banishes the true, velvety blackness of a sky unmarred by electric light. But in the ancient Egyptian work site, once the last smoky oil lamps were extinguished and the enormous communal fires banked, the darkness was absolute, a profound physical presence that enveloped the barracks, the colossal stone structures, and the entire plateau in a thick sensory blanket. This darkness was not merely the absence of light. It was a psychological phenomenon, a realm of profound vulnerability that amplified every subtle sound. The shuffling of men in the barracks, the quiet scuttling of desert creatures, the low, distant howl of a jackal, and every flickering shadow that danced in the meager, shared light of a single, sputtering oil lamp. Without the guiding light of the moon, which was often obscured by cloud or the ubiquitous smoke of the communal fires, movement outside the barracks was a treacherous, terrifying endeavor, a blind negotiation with the uneven ground, the scattered tools, and the unseen, lurking presences, the dangerous snake, the scuttling scorpion, or the imagined malevolent spirits of the desert. This profound darkness enforced a massive, collective stillness upon the community, a necessary psychological retreat from a world that had become entirely unreadable and uncontrollable, a nightly surrender to the primal fear of the unknown. The only sounds that broke this silence were the sounds of the natural world, amplified by the pervasive blackness, or the private sounds of the vast, concentrated humanity. The dry, persistent cough of a sick worker, the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the deeply sleeping men, the low, mournful baying of a distant dog in the village. These sounds, undampened by traffic noise or the hum of electricity, were sharp, immediate, and often profoundly unnerving, lending a thrilling, terrifying edge to the long, cold hours of the night. A constant, low-grade awareness that the world outside the thin walls of the barracks was a vast, chaotic, and dangerous place. The psychological effect of this undimmed darkness was a necessary reliance on the small, contained pool of warmth and life within the barracks, fostering the intense, inescapable communal living we have already described, a huddling together against the vast, unknown, and potentially hostile night. Sleep, therefore, was not a luxurious indulgence. It was a fundamental biological defense mechanism, a necessary 8-hour obliteration of consciousness that allowed the body and the mind to entirely shut down and recover from the persistent stresses of the day. The sheer physical fatigue of the unautomated labor ensured that once the head hit the hard clay brick floor, the descent into sleep was swift, profound, and utterly dreamless, a deep, necessary blackout that prepared them for the relentless demands of the morning. The final, soft, comforting truth to take with you into your own luxurious modern sleep is the simple, profound miracle of your ability to simply reach out your hand and flick a switch, instantly banishing the true, consuming terror of the absolute dark. A simple technological act that entirely dismantles the psychological structure of the ancient night, granting you a profound, unprecedented peace that was entirely unattainable by the exhausted, profoundly communal, and entirely light-deprived pyramid builder. In this final, gentle drift toward sleep, we will consider the final, profound difference between your comfortable, modern existence and the harsh reality of the pyramid builder's world, the immense, unbridgeable chasm of material choice and personal agency. Your life, dear listener, is defined by an almost paralyzing array of options: what to wear, what to eat, what to watch, where to go, what profession to pursue, a level of personal, self-directed control that is the true defining feature of your modern freedom. The pyramid builder's life, however, was a profound study in the absolute lack of choice. A life so tightly constrained by state service, necessity, custom, and law that the vast majority of their decisions were simply made for them, ensuring a trajectory that was both predictable and fundamentally unchosen. The question of what to wear was not a choice between 100 different fabrics and styles. It was a simple, pragmatic decision between a rough linen kilt and a brief, necessary moment of nakedness, a simple uniform of function that rarely changed from the day they arrived at the work site until the day they left. The question of what to eat was not a choice between cuisines. It was a negotiation between dense, gritty bread, yeasty beer, and a predictable ration of protein, a menu dictated by the unrelenting demands of state logistics and survival, with every meal a study in monotonous repetition, the only variation being the precise ratio of grit in the bread. Even the choice of profession was often predetermined, with most men simply fulfilling a period of state-mandated labor, and the specialized artisans often inheriting the trade of their parents, the son following the father to the quarry or the drafting office, a social and economic destiny that was fixed, a system that provided stability but entirely denied the possibility of self-invention or radical personal change. This lack of choice, this profound, non-negotiable channeling of their existence, meant a kind of quiet, humble resignation, an acceptance that the structure of their life was a massive external force, the will of the pharaoh, the demands of the cosmic order, the relentless schedule of the Nile, that could not be fought, only endured with stoicism and grace. This acceptance, however, freed them from the profound anxiety of modern decision-making, the quiet, persistent stress of having to perpetually define and redefine oneself through a constant stream of consumer and professional choices. The pyramid builder's mind was not plagued by the fear of missing out, the fear that their life was not optimized or that they had chosen the wrong path, because the path was simply the one that was available, the one that ensured their survival and contributed to the cosmic order, a profound, simple certainty that eliminated an entire category of modern psychological distress. And so, as you lie here, comfortable, warm, and utterly free to choose the trajectory of your next day, you can let the final, gentle weight of their unchosen existence settle upon you. A final, quiet reminder that your freedom, your comfort, and your sheer, overwhelming array of options are the most magnificent, unearned luxuries of the modern age. Let the scratchy phantom of their linen, the smoky air of their barracks, and the deep, silent ache of their physical exhaustion serve as a final, hypnotic lullaby. A soft, low-frequency hum of historical discomfort that will only make the soft, clean reality of your own sheets feel all the more profoundly comforting as you drift now, gently, safely, and entirely alone, into the deep, dark, and utterly peaceful sleep of a world they could only have dreamed of. A world where the day's most difficult task is simply choosing what to dream about.